All right, on today's podcast, we have Robert Shiller. Robert is a Nobel laureate, meaning he's won the Nobel Prize in economics. He's got the hardware. He's professor of economics at Yale. Go Bulldogs. He's written countless papers, articles, and books, including Irrational Exuberance, which predicted the bubble in equities in the year 2000, as well as the housing crisis. He's the Shiller in the Case-Shiller Indices, which we now measure home prices with in this country. And he's the author of the 2019 book and the main subject of today's discussion, Narrative Economics. How are you, Robert?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm great. Did I miss anything there?
Well, I've had a long career. You've got the highlights. It's good.
All right. So before we get into narrative economics, let's touch a bit on your book, Irrational Exuberance, which admittedly, I haven't read that one. I am familiar with some of the highlights. And in 2005, you appended to it, because it was written in 2000, to say that the housing market was overheated at the time. And you laid out the CAPE ratio, which is the cyclically adjusted price to earnings ratio,
Right.
also known as the Shiller PE ratio. So from my question for you, before we dive into narrative economics, is right now the S&P's Shiller PE ratio is at 37.29. So 37.3 times earnings. And it's the only time it's ever been higher is from November 1998 to November of 2000, when the price of the S&P peaked in December of 1999, and the Shiller PE ratio was 44.2 times earnings. So what do you make of the high in the Shiller PE ratio right now?
Well, this is a case of a rare event. There's only one other time when it was approaching this level, and that is 1929. So the past two times when the CAPE ratio was high, it was followed by a crash. Okay, but that's only two times, and there's always uncertainty about the stock market. It's hard to forecast the stock market. So I'm thinking that part of the reason that the U.S. we're talking about the U.S., which has a much higher CAPE ratio than other countries. Part of the reason the U.S. stock market is so highly priced is that there's a narrative, which may be right. The narrative is that the United States is the world leader in information technology and communication services. And there's a sort of American genius behind this. And it will continue, especially now when we're much more of a virtual reality. The world is changing. And a lot of things that we used to rely on, like railroads, to get to our subways or that you would get to work on, that may be not needed so much. And so we need other things. So there is the idea that America is worth every penny. Okay, it's especially strong here. But, I think it's strong abroad, too, that foreign investors are noticing that we produce Google and Amazon and other Microsoft. So there is the American success narrative. And when I write a book called Narrative Economics, I'm not saying that the narratives are always wrong. They are viral because of their appeal. And there can be both a genuine appeal and a spurious appeal. In this case, you're never sure about what the market is going to do. So I'm not being alarmist about this, but it does worry me.
I think if you were to distill what you just said, it kind of sounds like there's a premium on the safety of American companies right now, and also just a premium on the innovation coming from America. A previous guest on this podcast is Ben Hunt, who also has done a ton of work on narratives, and he has a post where he talks about how a lot of investing really just comes down to the flow of capital. And it kind of seems like right now there's a narrative out there that the reason why so much money has been put into equities is because there's kind of nowhere else to put it.
Right.
Do you think there's any value to that narrative right now?
Well, interest rates are low. So in that sense, there's nowhere else to put it. But there are low CAPE ratio sectors or stocks, and there are the rest of the world as well to invest in. So I think most discussions of the level of the stock market don't point out that it's the U.S. market that is the highest, and it's a U.S. phenomenon. So I think that a sensible portfolio now would have some U.S. stocks in it, but maybe less than most U.S. investors do. We have to understand that our patriotic zeal, it is a good thing in many ways, but it might lead us to ignore some investments that are not so overpriced.
Gotcha. All right. Well, I think that's good enough for to dive in. I had to get the quote on the topical issues of the day, but this is the Narrative Monopoly podcast, and we're going to be talking about narratives here today. So I'm going to jump into actually chapter 3 of this book, where you basically you describe what are constellations and confluence of narratives, and also talk about contagion. And a big piece of this book is making the analogy that narratives spread in similar fashion to infectious diseases. And now I'm sure that you wish that it turned out a different way, but the timing of that
Yeah,
analogy, it makes it really simple for people to understand now, because so many people have become familiar with the contagion rate and the recovery rate, which you dive into. So I'm going to read a quote here from the book, and then we'll take off from there. Quote, a key proposition of this book is that economic fluctuations are substantially driven by contagion of oversimplified and easily transmitted variants of economic narratives. What do you mean by
right.
that?
Yes, well, the stock market moves in mysterious ways. So does the housing market. Why should that be booming right now? So is the bond market. We had interest rates on 10-year treasuries that were about 0.5% in the summer of 2020. And that's awfully low for a 10-year rate. You'd think that people would expect more than that over the next 10 years. So there are always mysterious forces that seem to be driving. One reason why I think we don't understand them is that the forces are not really recorded by economic data collectors. They do have questionnaire surveys like the Gallup poll, but they don't get into the narrative. They just ask you simple questions. They don't ask for a story. So some stories are going contagious, like diseases. But the reason that they're going contagious is that they just have some immediate appeal. There might be a celebrity who's connected with it, and people love to talk about celebrities. Or it may be kind of a joke-like thing, a funny story. In fact, that's part of what spreads ideas, just simple jokes. Economists feel it's undignified, have felt it's undignified for them to talk about such things. There's also a problem that narratives seem to have a lot of variance. And that's why I talk about constellations of narratives. There's a lot of similar narratives that take off in different directions, and that we don't have a good way of quantifying them and reporting statistics on them. So it's impressionistic. Most economists don't want to be impressionistic. They're supposed to be experts. And maybe most economists just don't have the patience. You'd have to read kind of bad stuff sometimes. It's not just the elite newspapers, it's also the tabloids and the scandal sheets that might spread narratives. So it's something that is not, university libraries tend to subscribe to distinguished books by impressive authors, and they don't subscribe to the junk stuff.
Yeah, you touched on the contagion and the constellations there. I think We'll get into the Contagion, but for the Constellations, I mean, I actually do think that this was probably the one thing that I took away from this book is most important because you talked about how they're tangentially related. I think here's a great example that most people will understand is and what you just said around kind of like the highbrow information may miss this stuff. You'd only be able to find out about the GameStop stuff from Reddit, right? From Wall Street bets with anonymous people in it.
Right,
Um,
right.
and in that constellation, you have now Dogecoin, which is quite literally a joke of a cryptocurrency that's spiking as we're
Yeah,
talking. And then in that constellation is populism on the political side, and they all kind of like touch each other. And those things that are tangentially related actually do influence each other. Is that kind of the argument you make in the book around narrative
yeah.
constellations?
Another thing that's happening, and I'm not an expert on this, is neuroscience is developing. And now there's even a society for neuroeconomics that has regular meetings. Now they're virtual. You could jump in onto one of them. So we're learning about the human mind. And one thing we're learning is that the human mind is very structured to appreciate human things. So in the fusiform gyrus of your brain, you have, maybe it's not just there, but you have facial recognition technology, which is very advanced. So you can recognize an individual in a flash. If you're shown a photograph of someone for a fraction of a second, you can positively identify, which is kind of remarkable. That's why does this evolve? Why do people have this tendency? It's because our ancestors they weren't living in the computer age. They were living with people, and it was very important to be on top of who said what and what warnings are being issued. And so we have channels of communication that are ancient, that are built into our brain. And the brain is structured to keep stories together. There's like a tape recorder in your brain that records the details of stories. So there's a certain tension about how much stories are really viral. There are people who think that no story can last very long because the mutation rate in transmission of a story from person to person is so high. On the other hand, there is the so-called telephone game. This game where you ask
Yeah.
participants to tell a story to another and then to another and then to another, and it comes out garbled at the end. But the problem is that the people who do the telephone game are trying to pick stories that mean nothing to anybody. And I think that it's not so bad. That the other example is our folklore studies experts who find that certain stories that people tell in the family are thousands of years old, like Little Red Riding Hood. That's been traced in a distorted way, but a story of a little girl who was deceived by a wolf, and she was wearing a red coat. Or Jack and the Beanstalk. That's 1,000 years old, and maybe more. So stories do stay with us if they have some kind of human quality that is stimulating.
I do think there's two things in that. It's you even have in this book you have examples of neuroscientists proving that parts of the brain activate, just as you said, and specifically around you said contagious metaphor or contagious narratives often function as metaphors, and that the brain becomes reliably active when they do MRIs in the
Right,
brain when they hear that.
right.
And then the second piece of that is kind of how you go into how these narratives can actually almost be reversed engineered from the biology piece that you're talking about, where if you have someone who's famous, you have something that's memorable. You just said Little Red Riding Hood. The example that you give in the book is the napkin from the Laffer curve story, which
Yeah,
apparently is not even true. that was the game of telephone, right? It occurred on a
Right.
next mutation. It just made it more memorable because people can imagine in their mind the napkin. It's like the story of Bill Gates, when he releases the mosquito in the malaria talk, and people remember the mosquito and then they remember the malaria. And so I think you do a good job of documenting, how people can kind of engineer that. Do you think that is something that is conscious in a lot of these narratives that bubble up, that, you have to have these pieces of the puzzle to actually make them go viral?
Well, there are people who thrive on narratives, and they tend to be successful as politicians. To be a successful politician in any country, you have to understand what the people are talking about, and they tend to manage their narratives. Successful politicians, in extreme cases like Adolf Hitler, he actually hired a school of speakers and sent them out. He had thousands of speakers who gave his party line. They were given instructions like, never admit you are wrong. Okay, you're never wrong. Just try to, if someone points out a factual error, just brush it aside. And then another thing I was just reading the other day, Hitler had instructions to his photographers that he should only be photographed in inspirational settings, and he should not be seen as an ordinary human being. So there are very few pictures of him leading a domestic life or talking casually. He's always making a bombastic speech to a roaring supportive crowd. So you create a narrative, and it can be very constructed to be contagious.
Right. And then the contagion rate, which is the next piece of that, almost the distribution piece. You talk about how it's just like an epidemic disease where you have to have a contagion rate higher than the recovery rate. So if more
Right.
people are talking about it, that has to be higher than the people who are forgetting about it. How did you come up with that? Because there's actually a good amount of math in the back of the book that
Yeah.
digs into this.
Well, I've been thinking about this for 40 years. So I wrote a paper in 1984 called Stock Prices and Social Dynamics that mentions epidemic models. So I've been thinking about it a long time. Also, how did I come up with the mathematical models that epidemiologists use? It partly reflects a philosophy of science that I have, that it's advantageous to read in other disciplines. So in any given department, there's a sort of esprit de corps that develops. And we're smarter than anybody else. And we don't even read other journals from other fields. I also sometimes asking professors that I have in my own university, where is the sociology department located after all? They don't even know sometimes they don't even know what building the sociology department is in, let alone know who's there. If you want to be successful in academia, you do specialize, and it can get specializing too much. So I figure that we have a school of public health at Yale. I haven't been very good. I've never gone to a seminar there. They don't know I exist. Well, maybe they know I exist, but that's about all. But it's a philosophy of mine that now it's that a lot of the breakthroughs in science occur at the junctures of different specialties. And it's good to listen to what others are doing. So epidemiology became a favorite of mine. And I've included it in my lectures, macroeconomic theory, for many years.
And this is your idea of consilience, if I'm saying that right?
Right. So, yeah, the word consilience was coined in the 1840s by a philosopher of science in the UK named William Whewell. He invented a word. And what it means is the unity of all the intellectual disciplines. It was, again, a statement of the idea that one should try to bend effort to learn about what other disciplines are capable of doing and not to be too socialized into your own department. That was E.O. Wilson wrote a book maybe 20 years ago. He's a biologist called Consilience. And he's an example. So, for example, he studies ant societies. Okay. Ants have a society. They have a queen, they have battles with other ants, and they have territory that they defend, and specialized jobs for different ants in the ant colony. Would economists, there are some economists who study ants, okay? They don't have money. They haven't gotten to that stage yet, but they do have a society. So one should be doing pleasure reading. I think, yeah, I recommend reading Wilson. He's interesting, but he's not talked about very much in economics departments.
Is your argument that the the combination of what is essentially science and humanities and in Consilience, that discipline will increase accuracy in economics, that adding the stuff that is harder to measure, not impossible, but harder to measure. I mean, it is possible,
Yeah.
impossible to measure word of mouth, but harder to measure, is the goal to increase accuracy in the field of economics?
Well, yeah, it's a question. I don't have a science of consilience. Maybe it's not that well developed, because you could go too far into reading just everything and never specializing. And also for young scholars who are pursuing tenure at a university, maybe they are best advised. Not quite. They would be more toward the, I'm going to stay within the bounds of my profession and do some groundbreaking research. But once you get tenure, I think that you want to shift a little bit toward becoming a broad reader and trying to think about how we can deal with some of the anomalies that are observed. Any economic theory or any theory has anomalies that don't seem to be quite explained by the theory. And you have to keep thinking about those and reading, looking for other toolkits to design a study of them.
Now, narrative economics, in a sense, and you've touched on this, has been a lot of your kind of the culmination of your life's work in adding this piece to the economic pie. Or economics pie. Do you see this, or do you want this to become a discipline in the same way that econometrics is kind of a sub-discipline in economics?
Well, I think there has to be some specialization, within limits. That doesn't mean I want to create a department of narrative economics, okay? Because they won't talk to the other economists. Now, another cause that I've been behind for 30 years is behavioral economics. That has become more and more, behavioral economics is economics and psychology. The method used is often experimental. They'll have an experimental market and they'll observe how people behave in it. So that we can do experiments. But that's not a separate department. It's gaining acceptance in mainstream economics departments, and that's what we want to see happen. We don't want over specialization in an antagonism. By the way, I also like mathematical economics, and so I think they have a lot to offer too.
Right. I think just in this scenario, narratives appear to me to be the vectors which drive behavioral economics.
Right.
Is that fair to say?
That hasn't been the main emphasis, though, of behavioral economics. So behavioral economics is not really talking about the stories that change economic behavior. They tend to talk about fundamental economic or psychological issues. For example, overconfidence. Most people think they're above average. Not everyone. You have something called the inferiority complex that some people have who feel inferior to other people. But most people, when they approach investing, say, if they have an initial success, they'll start to define themselves as a brilliant stock picker. And then that can lead them to make mistakes. But the behavioral economics does identify a lot of psychological principles. I think it's closest to psychology. Psychologists do experiments also. Neuroscience seems, I think that's starting to grow in economics too. But sociology, which is very basic to narrative economics, just doesn't have a fan club in the economics departments, and I'm not sure just why. But it's not. There is socioeconomics that sociologists do, but I don't think it's talked about very much by economics department members.
That's interesting. Yeah, I can't say that I'm well versed on the the intricacies of the cross disciplines in the academy. But let's switch gears for a second and go back to narratives. There's kind of this paradigm that's commonplace on Twitter where it's really easy for things to go viral on Twitter because all you have to do is push a button, the
Right,
retweet
right.
button, and it goes to everyone, and it's this huge multiplier effect. What often happens when there is a fake piece of content, there's a tweet that contains a falsehood, is the falsehood is it's dramatic, it's sexy, it attracts a lot of attention, and it
Right.
results in going highly viral, and it ends up with tens of thousands of retweets. But then when there's a correction a few hours later, a few days later, whatever it is, the correction never gets any attention.
Right,
And
right.
you put this very eloquently in a book with actual data. You say that, truth is not enough to stop false narratives. You say the illusion won out even after it had been decisively disproven because the proof did not spread as fast as the illusion. And that was in reference to a First World War narrative. So is this just baked into humanity, or is there any hope for truth in terms of viral narratives?
Well, yeah, there is a hope for truth in the sense that we are an advanced society. Our airplanes fly, they don't crash very often. And when you go to the doctor, you generally get good advice. But the equilibrium is not perfect. I wrote another book with George Akerlof called Fishing for Fools, The Economics of Manipulation and Deception. And we consider it a fault of the capitalistic system. We still like capitalism, but a fault of the capitalistic system that it encourages marketers to put things out that are manipulative. So we have the example of a monkey on, we all have a monkey on our shoulders, okay, which is our primitive brain, which is not our refined judgments. The monkey is impulsive and grabs at things. So if you were shopping in a grocery store with a monkey on your shoulder, the monkey would be shopping too. It would not be enlightened. It'd be grabbing things, eating them on the spot, that sort of thing. They can open packages, by the way, monkeys can't. So the marketers aim for the monkey. I'm not against marketing, by the way, as a profession. It can be, it's a powerful tool, and it can be used for good and bad, both.
Yeah, I do think that a lot of the heat that advertising takes is more so part of a narrative. In that, if you have a product and you want it to reach more people and it solves their problem, you can pay to do that. I think that's a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
As far as the truth in narratives, though, what is it about the fact that it's often the narrative that doesn't contain the kernel of truth that forces it, or not forces it, but kind of creates this environment where it does have a higher contagion rate? Or maybe that's not true at all. Maybe
Yeah.
that's just
Yeah, it's very hard to define what causes the contagion rate. Some people have a gift for doing that, and they tend to be screenwriters or politicians. Others, most of us, never understand why something went viral. A certain personnel or certain, if you were asked to listen to the latest pop music just before it was released, you'd have trouble telling which ones are going to be. And even if you could tell, you couldn't put it into words what it is. What is it about this song that is so appealing? And you might feel disparaging of the songs that are most popular. I give the example in my book of the song, Happy Birthday to You. Okay. Is that a favorite song? Well, yeah, it turns out that it was written by in the 1890s, but it didn't have happy birthday in it. And it was some unknown person substituted the word happy birthday. It was good morning to you initially. Then it became happy birthday to you. Why is it so contagious? Because it's built around a story now. It's the birthday party, which weren't, it used to be that the birthday parties 100 or 200 years ago that we heard about were saints' days. It would be the birthday party for a saint in the church. But they developed into a tradition of a ritual that we go through on people's birthdays. It's confirming of love and friendship. And there's an actual ritual that we go through. You bake a cake, and you decorate the cake, and then you put candles, one for every year, and then you bring it out with great fanfare. You know exactly and you sing "Happy Birthday to You." That, I think, is the most popular song in the world. It started in the United States, which tends to be an exporter of culture, but now they sing it every country of the world. It's in China. It's in the Arab countries. It's all over. And is it because anybody likes it? You'd have to reflect on the contagion. Why is it so popular? I think it's because it's become associated with a narrative. I've just described the birthday party narrative and the ritual and the repeated. We all know the song. That's because we've been to so many birthday parties that not necessarily a big shindig, but just a birthday occasion, and we all sing it. So everyone, that makes for a very high contagion rate. The thing is, when it started out, the authors of the song had no idea what they were doing, that it would be so contagious. It was a couple of women who wrote the song, they put it in a book of music for kindergarten. Okay. Good morning to you, the same melody, and they never got rich off of it.
Well, I think that's your point around repetition, right? Is it's got that perfect hook where it's just, on your birthday, you gotta sing this song. And I think you make the point in the book around October, I think it was October 29th is the date of the crash, where every year, even though there's no data to support it, like, investors just get real nervous,
right,
because that can happen.
Yeah, the 29 crash was developed into a powerful narrative. If you look at old newspapers, there wasn't, the New York Stock Exchange, it goes back to 1792 when it was founded, but the newspapers didn't talk about it. And they had financial panics, but there was no stock price index like the Dow Jones Industrial Average until 1890s. But when they developed the Dow Jones Industrial Average, only experts, nerds read about it. It didn't seem, but the idea that it was a barometer of the economy, a forecast, a guru, like tea leaves or something, really developed strongly in 1929. And then stories around that people jumped out of buildings because of the stock market. They killed them. But long ago, John Kenneth Galbraith pointed out that the suicide rate really didn't go up in 1929. Not many people killed themselves because of the crash. But that's the story, that somehow the stock market is it's like taking the temperature of the economy. They want to know every day what the stock price, what the Dow Jones Industrial Average is doing. That's a narrative which has grown very strong. The Great Depression narrative is stronger now than it was during the Great Depression, by a long shot.
I thought that was a very interesting part of the book, where you talk about how there's kind of this lag in distribution of these narratives, and the actual I don't want to call it basically a myth of the Depression became stronger as time went on, and with each economic recession or stock market crash, and you also go into the actual terms boom and crash and how they came to be. But with each of those, like 2007, it's almost as if the depression and what happened around October 29 was worse than what actually did happen. And then that idea actually comes back and impacts the actions that people take in the moment. Let's say 2007, for example, and it's based off of these narratives that have grown over time.
Right. So in 2009, there was a powerful rebirth of the Great Depression narrative and the 1929 crash narrative. It came back again in 2020. Between February and March, the market lost over a third of its value in the United States in a matter of 1 month. And what were they talking about? Well, we now know we have social media. So if you do a Google Trends search, you find these things. Attention to the Great Depression suddenly came up. So narratives can suddenly become contagious because circumstances change, which operate like a mutation in a virus that brings a second wave. We've seen that in COVID-19. There were several waves in many locations. They also show that these things are somewhat regional. But I think it's less regional now than in the past because of the social media. Also, disease viruses are less regional now, too, because people are traveling around the world and spreading much faster internationally. So this may be a viral age we're moving into, both for thought viruses, that is narratives, and disease viruses.
Yeah, one narrative from the Great Depression that you pointed out is probably actually not true, which was the Joe Kennedy selling all of his stock after or all of his positions after the shoe shine boy gave him a tip. Actually not true.
Well, it goes back earlier. That narrative is attributed to other great men, always men, but before that.
Yeah, I mean that's the mutation right there, and then it picked up on, as you said, someone who is famous and recognizable, so you can actually remember that. Because if it was just some guy with a bunch of concentrated positions sold, no one would remember it. It's the fact that it was Joe Kennedy is why you remember it.
Right. Although Joe Kennedy is gradually slipping in the. He was a narrative for a while, and I think I have to check that he's probably declining. It's a sad fact. I hate to emphasize this, but we'll all be forgotten eventually. So the hump-shaped pattern of overall pattern for narratives, for diseases, maps into narratives as well. Some people grow after they die for many years. Karl Marx, for example, he died in 1880s, and he didn't peak in terms of narrative strength until the 1970s, and he's still pretty high. So that is the contagion of the Marx narrative has been very strong.
When I think about antiquity and deep into the past, I mean, can probably only name 5 people. I mean, Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan. I mean, there's really not that many.
And they were all good at narratives. Alexander the Great issued coins with his picture on it to give a visual image to the stories about. And Genghis Khan, there was a book that was written by his, I think around the time of his lifetime, The Secret, what is it called? I tried reading it 20 years ago. It was another contagious narrative in its day.
Well, I think that's really interesting that when you talk about contagious narratives, it goes back all the way that far in history, because my initial thought when picking up this book was that internet distribution is what caused this, and then I obviously read the book and realized that a lot of these narratives became contagious way before we had internet distribution. But my question to you now is, how does internet distribution change the contagion rate of these narratives?
Well, the internet is it can cause a very big multiplication because it moves very fast, minute by minute. It also allows people to identify with subgroups that are scattered geographically. And it used to be that your next door neighbors mattered a lot. They're starting to matter a lot again during COVID-19 because we're isolated and we can at least find our neighbors. But offsetting that is Zoom and other communications media, which so I think there'll be more crazy narratives that sound crazy to people outside of a certain group. And it's a little worrisome. There's also a question of the future of social media, whether they'll be censored or manipulated by powerful forces. I don't know where we're going in history. It's a major event, the development of social media, and it's a viral event.
Yeah, I mean, we're obviously still in the very early innings of it as well, and so it will be interesting to see in 100 years what the narrative economics book is, reviewing what happened in this century regarding internet distribution. I mean, I think, in terms of the contagion rate, it also seems like the recovery rate would probably increase as well because there's just so much information flying at
Right.
you.
Yeah, there's a new technology for starting narrative. It's called clickbait. You notice that when you get onto a website, they have all these little photographs. It all has a visual image and some little 5-word sentence clip, like they'll name a celebrity and they'll say, of years past, look at how she looks now. You're tempted to click. There's probably some bad, really horrible looking old lady. You just
Oh
kind of
yeah.
are tempted to see it. You can multiply those kinds of clickbait narratives infinitely until you learn. It's part of growing up these days not to click on clickbait. But the science of influencing people, of going viral, is expanding. Marketing is, for good or ill, is becoming a growing force in our lives.
I would push back on that, in that I would say a lot of what Pulitzer and Hearst did with yellow
Oh, right,
journalism was probably clickbait, and you couldn't
right.
really opt out as easily.
That's right. Yeah, I talk about them in my book. And there was a reaction to yellow journalism. So, yeah, there was a period in the U.S. when lowbrow tabloid newspapers dominated. And they got us into a war in the United States, the Spanish-American War, with stories about Spanish atrocities that weren't even true. They were rumors. And I think that's one reason why yellow journalism faded somewhat after that. It never completely went away, but people developed newspapers that they trust in certain newspapers, and they have for many years continued to honor that trust.
Yeah, I think that it's certainly something to be studied moving forward. Well, let's get to the closing segment, which is actually tied to the beginning segment, which is your recent New York Times op-ed, looking back at the first Roaring Twenties to understand where the stock market may be heading. A Nobel laureate examines the pop culture of one of the greatest bull markets in history. So we touched on the Cape ratio before, but now to tie this together, mixing the science and the humanities, you talk about the pop culture piece. So what was the central theme of that article for the listeners?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time. Well, first of all, the biggest 10-year increase in stock prices was from 1919 to 1929 with my monthly data, real increase. The real value of an investment in stocks, reinvesting dividends, went up sixfold in 10 years. That was 20% a year appreciation on average. And that's the biggest. People are starting to refer to the current decade of the 2020s as the second Roaring Twenties, because we have seen a tripling of the stock market in the last 10 years. And it seems to be, it seems, at least the narrative is, that it's poised to go even much higher. So what I wanted to do was try to see how similar the current bull market is to the 1920s bull market. I don't. It's hard to do this. It's hard to be precise as we like as academics. I ended up reading some of the popular culture, Um, and First of all, as the 20s wore on, there was more and more discomfort with the idea that the stock market is such a great investment. They started talking about the price earnings ratio in 1928 in newspapers. There was never a single mention of the price earnings ratio in any newspaper that's indexed that I can search before 1928. So, but the market kept going up. It reached record high price earnings ratio, but everyone was faced with the same uncomfortable situation. The Boston Globe called it an uncomfortable. No, it was the New York Times, I think. It was an uncomfortable situation, uncomfortable feelings that we as investors have now, because we've missed out. Many of us have just missed out who haven't been in the stock market. So it became a big narrative. The Shoeshine Boy really was talking. That was in the Roaring '20s that story really took hold. The Shoeshine Boy really was giving stock tips to his patrons, and the amateur investors were flooding into the market then. Well, it's the same now. We have a big increase in retail trade. Back then, there was more of a party-like atmosphere. They had meetings at brokerage services or bucket shops until bucket shops were outlawed in many states in the 1920s. Bucket shops were places where you'd go and bet on stocks without buying them. And they were shady. They were like gambling casinos built around stock investing. So they kind of disappeared before the very end of the 20s. But brokerage firms were putting in customers' rooms. And they had a thing called a Translux movie ticker. This is in the 1920s that would show an image of the ticker tape to a large crowd in the customer's room. And men would go there and hang out. Women started going there to the customers' rooms. So there was a party atmosphere about this, which we see somewhat today. I don't think it's a direct mirror of the Roaring '20s, but it hasn't been as big. I worry, though, that it might continue. So it puts me in an uncomfortable feeling. And so I imagine many other people feel the same way. If you got into the market now, it would be late in an expansion with near record high CAPE ratios. But on the other hand, it keeps going up. And so maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe in the United States, it's because of the advent of technology, that information technology is emerging finally into and you're going to lose your job because you're doing something menial that a computer is going to replace. You better get into this information technology world, at least as an investor. It's that sort of narrative that we have now.
It is so hard if you're putting your own money to work right now, because on one hand, as you say, the all of the signage looks exactly the same as previous time points in history where there was about to be a bust. And at the same time, as you mentioned, it just doesn't feel like it's ever going to stop. Party's not going to stop. And maybe, this time is different, maybe, something's different. Cause I think that, as much as history repeats itself, there's a first time for everything. So maybe it isn't necessarily a bust. Maybe there's a correction or something like that. Let's finish on this. There is what at least seems to me a new narrative, which the contagion rate far outweighs the recovery rate right now, which is inflation. So have you taken a look at any of these indicators of inflation, whether that be, obviously we just talked about equities, but also input costs, like the cost of lumber I saw it has, I think, 4x'd in the last few months. There's a lot of different indicators right now, and home prices, obviously. So do you have any thoughts, if you put on the economist hat, around what's going on with inflation?
Well, you mentioned home prices. When home prices are high and demand that means it becomes advantageous for builders to build homes. unless lumber prices crowd that out. But it involves those who cut lumber, they'll increase that supply. So there will be a supply response. I think that this boom in housing market is a little different from others in that people are it's less important to be close to a center city. And you can build somewhere in a beautiful spot farther away if you don't have to commute. Well, we'll see how much this stay-at-home thing continues. But I think we're learning how to do business at home. So that means that the existing home prices might fall as the supply response picks up. Now, going back to inflation, I have a chapter in my book on inflation narratives, but it's on my agenda to think through this again. Inflation, but I talk about the wage price spiral narrative, which became popular in the 1970s. And it blamed inflation on labor, and particularly often on labor unions. Labor unions were going through a public relations disaster then. Jimmy Hoffa, the mafia-style labor leader, was bumped off by his rivals. That kind of stuff was going on. And the idea was that labor represents certain workers and is just unrelenting in its demand for increases. And the wage increases force that they have to yield to, that manufacturers have to yield to, lead to force them to raise their prices. And then the next year when labor negotiations occur again, the labor union will say, see, the consumer price index has gone up. We need even higher wages. That's a spiral. It goes from wage to price to wage to price. That narrative was very powerful in the 70s and 80s. I've started to see it coming back. We'll see if that narrative comes back, which gives people a sense that inflation is a hopeless problem. We can't solve it. We did solve it. Around the world, inflation has come down among most countries of the world. And there's no other reason than change in narratives and Federal Reserve or central bank policy that responded to the narratives. So I'm still thinking about what to expect about inflation and what kind of narratives might come back. But bond yields have been incredibly low, and that reflects a feeling that people had just a few years ago that inflation was solved. There's nothing more to worry about it. And now they're starting to worry about it. So that might be a self-fulfilling prophecy again.
Yeah, I think the one piece that is not a narrative, it's, I'm pretty sure I have this number right, and it's at least for sure in the neighborhood, which is 25% of all dollars were printed over the last year. And so I think that is probably also what's contributing to the narrative and perhaps, already working its way through the system and actually creating inflation.
Yeah, the money supply has gone up in ways that would make Milton Friedman gasp. Milton Friedman was a strong proponent of a fixed growth rate for money supply. It's gone way up.
Well, I think that the listeners of this episode will have a lot to think through, whether it's in terms of investing or making day-to-day decisions. Everyone should buy your book. I thought it was great. Learned a ton. It was also a fairly quick read, which I like.
Good.
Which I think is a strong selling point. But yeah, it's great. Narrative Economics by Robert Shiller, How Stories Go Viral and Drive Major Economic Events. Thanks for coming on the Narrative Monopoly podcast.
Well, Jeff, it was nice talking to you.
Thanks, Robert. Take care.